All right, so now, since I already touched upon the approaches of the European Union, and since I mentioned European Parliament elections also a couple of times in the preceding slides, what I thought would be interesting is to share with you several other particularities as I see them, and a few challenges to electoral integrity that are perhaps rather unique to this type of an election. And here I need to start by saying that although some 360 million EU citizens elect 720 representatives to a single supranational body, so to the European Parliament, this is in fact not one, but 27 elections happening in parallel in all of the EU member states. These elections are conducted on the basis of national electoral laws, so with only very limited common European rules. They are also run by national election management bodies, with only very loose coordination also at the European level. You might be also surprised to hear that there is no such thing as a European Election Commission. To add to that, there is also no single EU electoral register. European Parliament elections are conducted on the basis of national voters' lists. And the mechanisms to exchange data, for example, to track or to rule out multiple registrations or multiple voting, they are far from perfect. Now, as observer reports point out, it may be wonderful to have all of this diversity of regulation and practice in the European Union, but some of these particularities, they can actually pose challenges to electoral integrity. For instance, the fact that there is no single voting day in European Parliament elections. They usually take place over 4 days in June in different countries. There is also no single rule on who has the right to vote and who has the right to stand. The duration of campaign differs in all of the EU countries. There are different rules for open lists, closed lists, opportunities to vote from abroad. All of this may, in fact, undermine the equality of rights and opportunities, both of voters and of candidates across the EU. Now, quite frustratingly, for many European election experts that are working on electoral reforms and on European Parliament elections, what they emphasize is that important electoral reforms that have been initiated and that aim to address some of these challenges, they have been pending and haven't been adopted for over a decade due to the lack of political consensus among EU member states. So not an entirely, or let's say, a mixed picture. Now, it is largely due to the growing realization, and I'm shifting here to the topic of youth participation. It is largely due to this growing realization within the European Union that democracy cannot be taken for granted, that democracy requires protection and improvement, that European institutions have been placing a very heavy focus in the last years on outreach and on inclusion of all groups of the society. In the past, young people under the age of 35 have been clearly underrepresented in European elections, both as voters and as elected officials, even though they actually make up some 25% of EU population. The turning point was reached in 2019, so in the last elections, when after declining since 1994, the voter turnout in EU increased for the first time to 50.6%. Now, this increase was really largely attributed to a surge in youth participation. It really increased dramatically. So in order to capitalize on this positive trend, there has been much effort ahead of this June's elections to involve young people in different ways, especially because there were 25 million eligible first-time voters in these elections. Because of this, European institutions and European political parties, they have all been pledging that they would integrate youth perspectives and that really they have doubled on their outreach efforts, trying to involve young people in collaborative formats to stimulate a genuine dialogue. Youth has been increasingly positioned not only as a stakeholder, but also as a partner in different initiatives. It was also both the target, but also itself generated impressive amounts of very effective, visibly appealing educational and get out the vote campaigns. Sounds very positive. Now, with all of these efforts deployed, it is perhaps interesting to take a look at their effect or impact. And this is where I must say it does not give much ground for euphoria. As a result of this June's elections, the European Parliament basically stayed as old as the previous composition. The average MEP, so member of the European Parliament, the average age is now 50, which, okay, has gone down from 53 from the previous term. But only 10% of all of the members of the European Parliament are now 35 years of age. Only 10%. And there is a considerable disparity also across the countries. For example, you see the 5 countries circled. These are the 5 countries that have no young MEPs whatsoever. 8 have just 1 young MEP. And representation over 20% is really something that's rather. It is also perhaps interesting to see that political party policies did have an impact on how many young MEPs were elected. For instance, the lowest youth representation is in the largest mainstream EPP political group in the European Parliament, while the Greens are boasting the highest numbers of young MEPs. If we take a look at youth participation as voters, this is where we see that probably the impact of outreach has also been rather modest. Although detailed age disaggregated turnout data for the whole of EU is not yet available, what we have are some preliminary observations, and what they indicate is that there were likely no major shifts in trends compared to 2019. Although young people constitute the fastest growing segment of the electorate, so what you see from the top chart, they are also the most likely abstainers from voting, as you see from the bottom chart. It is also interesting to observe that youth abstention, so not voting, was not because political actors did not focus on them. Youth was a very clearly targeted group, for instance, on social media. Also, interestingly, this increased availability of information and awareness raising did not, in all cases, lead to greater participation. For many young people, not voting was actually a conscious choice. Another trend that is noted is that young people tend to vote less for mainstream and measured political positions and more often vote for niche, novel, more extreme, and more topic-oriented political parties. Now, it is very likely that in the coming months, once all of the European institutions are operational, that this discussion about youth participation in principle, but also in European elections, will be back on the agenda. The discussion has long been focused both on the search for the root causes of the problems of low participation and low representation, but also for possible panacea. What are the solutions? And typically here, four aspects come into the spotlight in these discussions, and I would like to share them with you. One barrier that is being increasingly pointed to are the age-related limitations. Most European countries allow voting at 18, Greece at 17, and only 4, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and Malta, allow it at 16. The minimum candidacy age also varies. Many countries grant it at 18, but 9 provided at 21, Romania at 23, and Greece and Italy at 25. Now, globally, the picture is also rather similar. 18 remains the most common voting age, and 21 is the most common age for candidacy. But the discussions about lowering both and possibly also aligning them so that they are at the same, granting voting and candidacy at the same age. This discussion is gradually gaining in prominence. First of all, this is seen as a way of increasing participation, increasing turnout. Research like this one here from Germany provides evidence that if you decrease voting age to 16, then over time, your voter turnout will increase. And this is what you see from the dark blue columns in the chart, compared to a situation if you keep your voting age at 18. This is what you see with light blue. Now, the reduction of the candidacy age is supposed to help with 3 things. First of all, it should align representation to the actual youth proportion in the population. It should bring new perspectives into policy discussion. And it should cater to what is described as intergenerational justice. So to correct the situation of youth being considerably affected by political decisions, but often excluded from the process. Another barrier that is noted is that probably young people are just not given fair chances of being elected from the outset. National political parties are often reluctant to include young candidates on their lists, and when they do include them, they typically put them on less attractive positions, so further down the candidate lists. In June European elections, young candidates effectively had, and you see this on the chart, they had only a 50% chance of being elected. In contrast, candidates in the age group between 55 and 75, they had the highest chances of securing a seat. So that disproportion. Now, these observations, they often put the role of political parties as gatekeepers and the democratic practices inside of political parties into the spotlight. Basically, a discussion in terms of how candidates are actually chosen, how are they nominated, and who decides what position on the list which candidate will get. For the moment, EU is not very imposing and does not dictate how intra-party democracy should be. But there is an increasing number of recommendations, policy documents, which emphasize the importance of including youth in the candidate list. It is also in the context of this discussion that youth quotas are also viewed as a possible solution by some international actors and civil society organizations. There is, however, some caution and reservation here. The reason is that, as you see from these two charts here, is that youth quotas are actually not that common. Only 13 countries globally use them, and at the moment, this includes none of the EU countries. The countries that do use them, they typically set the target for representation at 35 or 40, and they also provide for different types or different forms of legally binding quotas. So, for instance, there may be a requirement for a fixed percentage of young candidates on candidate lists, as it is in Kyrgyzstan, 15% is the requirement. Or there may be a fixed percentage requirement for the seats to be filled by young candidates within the legislature. So, for example, there is a requirement of 5 seats in Uganda. Now, what is very clear is the positive effect of quotas. They do lead to numeric increases in representation. Their effect, what we have to recognize, is that their effect varies depending on the electoral system that is used, how quotas are designed, and also if they are linked to other quotas, for example, gender or national minority quotas, as it is in Kazakhstan. Such united or unified quotas, they are, according to the research, they are having a mutually reinforcing effect. Now, and I'm turning here to the last point for now, discussions about these various measures are often ultimately pointing to one overarching issue. And that is whether there is actually a sufficient degree and consistency in democracy and citizenship education that is being provided to young people. So putting citizenship education or civic education in the spotlight. Within the EU, there are a lot of dispersed efforts aimed at raising awareness about the importance of elections and participation, but currently there is no single unified strategy for the whole of EU. There are increasing attempts to design tools, digital tools that use technologies and speak Gen Z language, so to say. So what is becoming increasingly popular are digital vote match applications, where you basically get advice on what parties best match your political views and preferences. Now, such efforts are definitely very helpful and are very needed in order to address situations as depicted here of young voters, let's say at the age of 16, neither knowing nor really caring who they're voting for. So they would end up voting for options that correspond to their vision of whatever as the last option on the ballot that you're seeing here on the picture. But what examples from countries that reduce the voting age, what they show to us, and Austria is one particular success story in this respect, is that what they demonstrate is that the positive effect of reduced voting and candidacy age will only then be achieved if it is matched with appropriate civic education and it is ingrained into secondary school curricula. And this is the direction in which EU, for example, is pledging to go in the coming years. Now, with this, I have actually come to the end of the presentation as such, and I would now like to invite you to bring this debate or the conversation that we've been having so far